let's pivot over to Alabama, where a fascinating special election for a state house seat was just held. There are results. Krystal, the media has talked a bit about it, but I don't think they've talked about exactly how impressive this margin of victory is for Democrats based on what happened just in the 2022 election in this district. So we can go ahead and put the first graphic up on the screen. This is Alabama State House District 10, where Marilyn Lands ran against Teddy Powell. She ran against a different candidate, David Cole, back in 2022. You can see the margin there. It was 52 to 45 Republican. Marilyn Lands just won this district 62 to 38 Democrat, a huge flip. And she, even as conservative media in Alabama has pointed out, she ran explicitly against the IVF decision in the Alabama Supreme Court that got headlines for literally weeks because it was so huge. She made that a centerpiece of her campaign, to the point where, actually, Krystal, I took a look at conservative media in Alabama's coverage leading up to the vote on Tuesday, and a lot of people seemed to think that she was running this national media campaign that wouldn't necessarily resonate in a hyper-local state house race.
Oh, interesting.
That the other candidate, the Republican candidate, had localized it. Yellowhammer News had an article. I read them for like the conservative take on Alabama politics. They have some good stuff. They wrote basically that he was focused on these hyperlocal issues and that she had made the abortion conversation a centerpiece of her campaign. And look at the margins.
Wow.
It wasn't what some people might have expected, which is if she nationalized a really local race and talked about these heavy divisive issues, she would turn off voters, and it wasn't, resonant with people in, this is like a district around Huntsville, it wasn't resonant. That's actually turned out to be very resonant.
Yeah, well, this is a district, I know everybody, you think Alabama, you think super red. This is a swing district. Trump won it by a single point, but she won it by a whole lot more than a single point. I mean, I was kind of shocked when we put this graphic up. I actually didn't realize that it was that large of a margin. It's quite astonishing. And I think there's a couple things going on here in these special election results, which this is not a one-off. We've consistently seen a trend of Democrats really outperforming in these special election, off-year elections that we've seen this year and before. I think there's two things. I think one, Ro, is absolutely huge. The fact that she tied this right into that IVF decision and just went after it really hard, and you have this kind of result. I mean, it's pretty undeniable, right? But the other issue you have for Republicans is now that you've had more of this realignment of college-educated voters, like white-collar voters, into the Democratic coalition, Republicans used to always have this advantage in midterms, off-year elections, special elections, et cetera, which is that their coalition was more likely, they were the more reliable voters. And that's not the case anymore. You partly have the issue we were talking about before about how there's a deep skepticism of things like early voting or early in-person or mail-in balloting or whatever. So you're limiting yourself in terms of the options you have getting to the polls anyway, making it more onerous on you anyway. And then you have these shifts in the coalition that lead to Democrats actually having more of the sort of I come out every single election, no matter what voters. And you end up with these, consistent outperformances in the special elections. It does make me question, too, the polling we've been looking at. It hasn't been reflective in terms of, I don't know that there was even any, public polling done in this race. But we've seen in other instances, we've seen Trump underperforming in his primaries. We've seen, Democratic outperformances consistently again outside of the polls in these special elections. So it also does make me question, are the polls missing some dynamic that's going on here that may have an impact on the presidential race? Now, on the other hand, that benefit of, the Democrats having in their coalition the reliable voter that's going to turn up even in the off-year election, that may not matter as much when you're talking about a presidential election, when, you have a large turnout. And so then you are bringing in more of the Republican coalition to the mix. But you've had this polling trend as well where Biden does really well with people who actually voted in the last presidential election. Trump, in one poll, I think it was the New York Times Siena poll, he was winning people who hadn't voted before, who said they were going to vote this time, by 23 points. So this will be one of the central dynamics of, whatever happens, Trump v. Biden.
That's a really good point. And actually, if we put this is C2 back up on the screen, this is probably not entirely surprising, but the Lance campaign, or Lance herself, said, today, Alabama women and families sent a clear message that will be heard in Montgomery and across the nation. Our legislature must repeal Alabama's no exceptions abortion ban, fully restore access to IVF, and protect the right to contraception. The president of the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, it's the big Dem organization in Alabama that's sort of squarely focused on these state races, called the victory, quote, a political earthquake. And of course, Democrats are going to spin something in a way that's best for them. But it's extremely telling that when Lance declared victory in a local House race, she said women and families sent a clear message about the no exceptions abortion ban, access to IVF, and the right to contraception. I mean, it's interesting because Republicans and conservatives in Alabama weren't necessarily wrong to look at a campaign like that in a local race and say, aren't there other things, like, don't we need new sidewalks or bike trails or something like that? That's a common, strategic mistake that people make, not in this environment.
All politics is national now. Yeah. It really is. It's just a different landscape. And I also think it's very telling, though, that the Republicans decided to run the hyper-local race and just avoid, because the other thing is, it's not like this IVF decision was a national decision. It was an Alabama situation. Yeah. So it is also local. It's not like she was opining on something over which she would have no say and no input in the state house there. But I do think it's a tell, because you see this dynamic often, where, let's say you have a Democrat running in a rural area that's trending red, let's say in Ohio, that's trending red or whatever. Yeah. They'll try to localize, I'm not like those Democrats in Washington. This isn't about them. This is about us right here in this place, et cetera. And that used to work very effectively. And I just don't think that it does really anymore. And, you can certainly point to certain examples where the trend goes in the other direction. But I think by and large, politics is national. And if you're fighting against some big national issue that voters really have on their mind and you just don't want to talk about it, and you're just trying to push it off to the side, like, don't think about that and don't worry about that. Right. It's a challenging landscape to try to operate in. But like I said, the fact that the Republicans just didn't even want to really approach this, didn't have I don't know what their response was. I don't know how they were talking about it, but they clearly didn't want to lean into that in their campaign, is indicative of how, even in a district that Trump did win by a point, this ruling was so toxic that they know they just have to run away from it. And even when they did, they're losing by, more than 20 points. So now, speaking of losing, a lot of people predicted that the Supreme Court's oral arguments in, actually it's a case where conservatives are running against the FDA. Right. Because of mifepristone, which is the oral abortion drug that is now accounting for more than half of abortions. We'll talk a little bit about that. But Erin Hawley, who is actually the wife of Senator Josh Hawley, was arguing on behalf of an alliance of doctors that is upset about the FDA's fast tracking of mifepristone. This was back in like 2000. This happened a really long time ago. And finally, someone brought a case about it that was the Fifth Circuit, which Ryan calls the crazy circuit. It tends to be more conservative, agreed that the FDA was wrong to fast track the approval of mifepristone when it did so at the time, all those years ago. But basically, standing was a huge question during the oral arguments that happened this week. And yet, on standing and other issues, that question of standing, meaning whether or not the alliance of doctors that Erin Hawley was representing has the sort of standing, has the legal sort of, not right, but the legal case to present this argument, to object to the approval all of those years ago. Erin Hawley was getting really tough questions from the conservative justices. So not just Ketanji Brown Jackson, but also from Brett Kavanaugh, also from Amy Coney Barrett, who of course was ushering in the era of The Handmaid's Tale when she was confirmed, and others on the Supreme Court. I think even Justice Roberts joined the sort of pile-on against Erin Hawley. So there's an interesting exchange here with Neil Gorsuch. Just listen to how he asks, it's a pretty pointed question, to Erin Hawley.
If we were to find that there are conscientious objections that say hospitals take them into account and these doctors do have a way to not do these kinds of procedures, should we end this case on that basis?
No, Your Honor. We would welcome that holding, but it's not broad enough to remedy our doctors' harm.
Why?
Because these are emergency situations, they can't waste precious moments scrubbing in,
No. I'm saying assuming we have a world in which they can actually lodge the objections that you say that they have. My question is, isn't that enough to remedy their issue? Do we have to also entertain your argument that no one else in the world can have this drug, or no one else in America should have this drug in order to protect your clients?
So again, Your Honor, it's not possible given the emergency nature of these situations.
Counsel, let me interrupt there. I'm sorry. I think Justice Jackson's saying, and let's spot you all that, okay, with respect to your clients. Normally, in Article 3, traditional equitable remedies, we issue, and we say over and over again, provide a remedy sufficient to address the plaintiff's asserted injuries and go no further. We have before us a handful of individuals who have asserted a conscience objection. Normally, we would allow equitable relief to address them. Recently, I think what Justice Jackson's alluding to, we've had, one might call it a rash of universal injunctions or vacatures. And this case seems like a prime example of turning what could be a small lawsuit into a nationwide legislative assembly on an FDA rule or any other federal government action.
So what you heard there is a heavy focus on the question of standing. If you were listening to this and not watching, you heard Ketanji Brown Jackson ask questions about that. And then you heard Neil Gorsuch, a Trump-appointed justice, interrupt with some really pointed questions of his own for Aaron
Kind of came in over the top, like, let me break this down.
Right. Krystal, are you surprised by that? A lot of conservatives are not remotely surprised by how Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett have expressed their skepticism. Obviously, standard disclosure, you never know based on oral arguments. People are often very surprised by what happens after oral arguments. Yet, this one was sort of resoundingly against Erin Hawley and her Alliance of Doctors.
I'm not particularly surprised because I think the Supreme Court is trying to almost like rescue Republicans from the most extreme conclusions of the positions that they've, staked out. Sticking down.
Yeah, that's it.
We're going to go with that. In any case, they also are very concerned with, especially Roberts, with the standing of and credibility of the court. Mm-hmm. So if the court is going out there and like, hey, IVF is banned and no more, abortion pill that is used now for 63% of abortions, and they're just like going wild after Dobbs, then you're going to have a real problem of legitimacy of the court. You could have a real movement to, stack the court or term limit or age limit or something. And by the way, those sorts of things, certainly the age limit and term limits, really popular if you ask the American public. Yep. So you can easily see some momentum getting behind an idea like that if you have decisions routinely coming down that are wildly at odds with where the American people are. My view of the court is that they take into consideration more of the political aspect of things than they do necessarily, then they'll find the legal grounding for wherever they want to be politically, ideologically, et cetera. But in terms of this legal question of standing in particular, multiple of the justices, many of the conservative justices were saying basically like, listen, okay, so you're a group of doctors that has this religious-based objection to prescribing mifepristone or performing abortions. So ordinarily, the normal sort of resolution or solution to that problem would be to give you a conscience exemption. You already have that. So now rather than, being fine or filing some small lawsuit, as Gorsuch was suggesting there. Now you're trying to claim injury, even though you already have an exemption here. You don't have to prescribe mifepristone. No one is making you do that. You're trying to stretch to find some sort of harm that could theoretically be done to you. And in the course of, establishing that standing, then you want to take the ability of the entire nation to have access to this FDA-approved drug. So a lot of the questioning focused on that and didn't even get into what's called the merits of whether or not you can, use this process to overturn what the FDA found, because the FDA said, hey, this is safe. There's lots of studies that say it's safe. There are very few problems or complications with it. And their argument is, no, the FDA was wrong and they didn't do enough to make sure that it's safe. And so that's part of why we're harmed as doctors, because we could hypothetically, theoretically, have to treat a woman who's been injured by these pills, even though we didn't prescribe it. And so I do think it's fair to say it's a bit of a stretch. They couldn't point to an example where this has actually happened. They're just sort of theorizing that maybe it possibly could potentially happen and using that as a way to try to, undercut the FDA's approval for this drug for everyone in the entire country. So, bottom line, listen, like you said, you never know.
Yeah.
How it's going to come down. You got to wait and see and how it's going to go, whatever. But if you've got Amy Coney Barrett, who is obviously very religious and very ideological on these issues, if even she's looking at your case like, no, this doesn't make any sense to me in terms of the harm, in terms of the standing, then I think you are in a pretty tough position in terms of prevailing here. And you know what? I bet there are a lot of smart Republican operatives out there who are praying for the Supreme Court to say no to this and to, keep mifepristone legal because of the results we were talking about in Alabama and because of the national trend, which has now consistently been post-Dobbs for more and more and more people to actually embrace abortion rights. It really has sort of tipped the scales on an issue that previously was very much a 50-50 issue.
Yeah, and our viewers know that I represent the minority of the minority on the question of abortion. Like, pretty anti-abortion. I do think there's some scary stuff out there about mifepristone, and mostly it relates to doctors not doing a good job of prescribing it and saying, this is what might happen. These are possible complications, and there are some stories of women having awful experiences. That's not happening every time people take mifepristone, but that's why, that's at least an explanation for why conservatives felt that they should bring this case and why religious doctors, conservative doctors felt like they should bring this case. And so one exchange that was interesting just on that question of standing was between Justice Alito and the Solicitor General who was representing the FDA. Alito said, so your argument here is that it doesn't matter if the FDA flagrantly violated the law, didn't do what it should have done, endangered the health of women. It's just too bad. Nobody can sue in court. There's no remedy. The American people have no remedy for that. The Solicitor General replied, well, I think it would be wrong to suggest that if the FDA had made a mistake and a drug were actually producing safety consequences, that there was nothing to be done. I thought that exchange was sort of the best clash of both sides of the sort of Alito objection and the Solicitor General, the government's position here. It is just an interesting question. Also, again, Krystal, kind of like a flipping of the general political positions on like the FDA versus doctors. Like a lot of times you would have the FDA is basically funded by pharma, and you have a lot of conservatives that are very, in the past, have been very defensive of the FDA because generally it represents the positions of pharma.
Right.
And so here you have that like totally different clashing of opinions. So it's definitely like reading the tea leaves here. It looks like Thomas and Alito might be the only dissents in this case, and especially because like Gorsuch, Amy Coney Barrett, and Kavanaugh, a lot of conservatives see them as being more libertarian than quote unquote like a conservative, like Burkean conservative positions. Whether or not that's true, Gorsuch especially, people suspect that of. So just a really interesting presentation at the Supreme Court, and the political consequences. To your point, Krystal, we've got some polling.
Yeah, this is pretty interesting. Our producers pulled this. Let's go ahead and put this first one up on the screen. We've got specific question here from Fox News on, that liberal rag outlet, Fox News. Views on mifepristone and on a nationwide abortion law. And you have 68% saying that access to abortion medication, mifepristone, should be legal, and only 28% saying it's illegal. I would actually like to see the partisan breakdown there, because that level of support means there is a significant chunk of Republicans who also think that you should have legal access to this. They also asked about support for a law guaranteeing access to legal abortion nationwide. 65%, so more than a supermajority, say yes, we're in favor of that law guaranteeing access to legal abortion. Only 32% oppose. That would have been a very different result pre-Dobbs. In terms of views on abortion, here you can actually see the trend, which continues to move only in one direction. So now in March of 2024, you have 35% who say abortion should always be legal. You have 24% who say it should be legal most of the time. You have 32% who say it should be illegal except for the typical exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. And you only have 7% who say it should always be illegal. And, you know, that matters because there are a number of states where that is the de facto position, is that it should always be illegal. That's how you end up with a decision like in Alabama, even outlawing IVF. And you can see the way that this has shifted over time to move where people are moving more and more to the pro-choice position as it becomes really clear what the actual landscape looks like if you don't have those rights enshrined in law, and people very unhappy with potential IVF limits or going back to the stem cell debates or banning mifepristone. These are wildly unpopular positions with the majority of the American public.
One thing I wanted to point to in the polling is if you're looking at the movement between April 2022 and March 2024, a lot of Republicans, conservatives, anti-abortion groups will say Democrats' biggest vulnerability on this is the always legal group. That group has gone up since April of 2022.
That's the largest group now.
Look at that, 35% right now in March of 2024. And I agree, I think politically that is the sort of anti-abortion side's best, that's the best political message to defend themselves. I don't disagree with that. I think they're right about that. But it's getting less and less effective when polls show people say this should always be between a woman and their doctor. You know, if they want an abortion in the third trimester, it must be for a good reason. That's the argument now that anti-abortion candidates, groups have to address. And it's actually that's becoming more and more of an uphill battle. Also, what you see there is the legal except for rape, incest, save the life of the mother. That has gone down to 32% from 43% since April of 2022. And it is generally, and it was back in 2022, that was the biggest group. And now always legal is the biggest group, to your point, Krystal.
Yeah.
One reason for that might be people are having experiences with mifepristone that aren't the exceptions. We can put the Washington Post, this is actually C5, guys, you can put this up on the screen. The Washington Post headline here, abortions outside medical system increased sharply after Roe fell, study finds. Abortions after Roe fell are actually going up, and I think a lot of that is because of mifepristone. I mean, undoubtedly, a lot of that is because mifepristone. Pro-abortion groups have made a concerted effort to increase the availability of mifepristone and to increase public awareness about mifepristone. So this is something that has to be contended with in ways that I don't think, and of course it was clear. Ryan and I said this as it was happening on air when the Dobbs decision came out. The Republican Party has never been prepared for this.
It's true.
Never been prepared for this, even though the writing was on the wall that something like this could be coming and that people would be really deeply unhappy about it. And Krystal, your point about the court's perspective on itself, how it the threats to the sort of institutional trust of the Supreme Court, I bet that is weighing on their minds as they consider this huge case.
Yeah, because, I mean, they're consuming the news. They see this, what has been an extraordinary backlash. I mean, I really underestimated just what a massive shift this would be in terms of the politics of the issue, how much it would matter to people, how much it would dictate the results of elections. Every time, no matter what state you put it up in, if you've got a ballot initiative that's about abortion, the pro-choice side has won every single time. Results in Alabama where you're winning by close to 30 points based on, the fallout after this decision. They're very aware of that. They're very aware of that. And that, if they continue to, push in that direction and codify things that go even further than the Dobbs decision, that they're going to be on really thin ice. Because one thing that was noteworthy to me, looking at some of that polling, is that it's not like after Dobbs there was a major shakeup in opinion and it just stopped there.
Right.
The trend continues in this direction of more people saying, it should just always be legal, or it should at least be legal in most cases. And the people who are on the, the pro-life side, that number is dwindling and dwindling and dwindling, even within the Republican Party. And then the other thing that has really changed is previously, the group that was most organized and most activated on this issue were almost all on the pro-life side, where this was like the voting issue, and that's just not the case anymore. Now you have, I think, probably many more people who are really activated on the other side of this equation, and that's why you see such a tremendous shift in terms of electoral results. We played previously Trump getting asked about abortion.
His instincts on this are much better than most Republicans.
Yeah, but you can also tell he knows it's a problem.
Yes. Yep.
And there is no, he did the thing that you suggested of like, let's talk about, these partial birth abortions or end third trimester or when the baby's been born, which of course doesn't happen. But anyway, he tried to pivot to that, but that's just not the landscape that things are being fought on right now. The landscape that's being fought on is mifepristone and IVF and how much are you going to curtail the rights and, personhood bills, and is there going to be a national abortion ban, et cetera. And so I really don't think there is a messaging fix for this. So like I said, I'm sure Trump and a lot of other Republicans are very happy that the Supreme Court is going in the other direction with this mifepristone decision, likely because it would be a total political catastrophe for them if they went in the other direction. And they're just hoping that emotions around this die down and that they're able to reassure people enough that they're, not totally out on the fringes on this. But Trump is the guy that put those justices there, and you can't really run away from that ultimately. Like, it's very difficult. Like I said, I don't think it's something you can message your way out of because the reality has become so apparent to people.
No, it would need to be a culture shift for the politics to shift, and that would be it would have to be a dramatic culture shift.
Major culture shift. Yeah, for sure. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.